Every human being has fears. These fears affect people's dreams and plans. Everyone tries to get rid of the fear in times of chaos and war. Everyone's fears increase. The bombs exploding in Crimea are raising fears in the Kremlin. So what is Putin's biggest fear? What is the source of the explosions in Crimea? How much damage has the Russian Navy suffered? What is the Ukrainian army's plan for Crimea? One explosion after another in Crimea is the talk of the world. This could completely change the course of the war. It would be a breaking point for Putin as anchor daily news team. We conduct trillion research on the explosions in Crimea. It has been 14 months since Russia invaded Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has successfully defended itself against the Russian army, but Zelensky now wants this war to end completely. For this, the Ukrainian army is planned to start a major offensive in the spring. It is known that the Ukrainian army is making strong preparations for this offensive. Bayraktar drones, Leopard tanks, Javelin missiles, HIMARS systems will be used in this major offensive. The Ukrainian army will launch an operation with all its might, and as a result of this operation, the Russian army will be pushed out of Ukraine. However, it is not known exactly how this major operation would be carried out. The explosions in Crimea gave very important clues. All big organizations are rehearsed. Armies also conduct drills before starting operations. Sometimes they conduct operations to show their strength and check the battle plan. The recent explosions in Crimea would be a great rehearsal for a big offensive of the Ukrainian army. So what exactly happened in Crimea? Before discussing the details of this operation, let us recall the information about the Russian base in Crimea. As you know, the Russian army invaded Crimea in 2014. Crimea is a peninsula with very important ports. These points are strategic, important for dominating the Black Sea. The Russian army was planning to use these ports effectively. Moreover, the warehouses in Crimea are very important for the Russian military. The Russian army uses these warehouses to send weapons, food, fuel to Russian soldiers in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army made a great effort to break the logistics network of the Russian army. Russian trains and military vehicles carrying weapons were destroyed. Putin then decided that these weapons could now be transported through Crimea. The fuel for the ships, tanks, and all military vehicles of the Russian army started to be sent from Crimea. Putin first sent these fuel tankers to the Crimean harbor. Then Russian soldiers delivered this fuel to the war zone. The Ukrainian army intercepted this plan of Putin. It decided to launch an operation against Russian fuel depots in Crimea. An operation was launched for tons of fuel in the port of Sevastopol and the Crimean Peninsula. The Ukrainian army decided to use Bayraktar drones for this operation. These drones, which have very effective bombs, managed to silently reach the Russian fuel depots. The bombs dropped from the drones caused the fuel depot to burst into flames. The explosion in the Crimean harbor soon spread to the entire Russian base. In addition to the fuel depots, the hangar for military vehicles burned for a long time, as well as weapon depots. The Russian fire brigade in Crimea tried to extinguish this fire, but the firefighters were helpless because of the fire in the fuel tank grew in a very short time. The Russian army suffered a heavy defeat. The explosion at the harbor was visible from all over Crimea. Russian soldiers in Crimea were terrified by the sound of successive explosions. Commanders immediately contacted the Kremlin, but there was nothing the Kremlin officials could do because the Kremlin leaders were not ready for such a big operation. Speaking about Crimea 24 hours before the attack, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that all necessary security measures on the land, in the air, and at sea have been taken at the highest level. Following Peskov's statements, Russian soldiers thought that they were safe. However, the Ukrainian army showed the whole world that Russia can carry out very effective operations despite its defense plans. It is believed that the Ukrainian military planned to damage the Russian Navy by carrying out this operation. The ships of the Russian Navy were supposed to use the fuel in this port to carry out operations against Ukraine. However, the Ukrainian army managed to inflict heavy damage on the Russian Navy by destroying these fuel depots. Andrei Yusov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence service, also touched on this issue in a statement on the attack. Yusuf said the following about the big operation. We destroyed 10 fuel tankers at the facility of the Polsek Bay near Sebastopol. The Russian side lost about 40,000 tons of fuel, which it intended to use for Navy ships. The Ukrainian army managed to carry out such a large operation using only 6 drones. So what will the Ukrainian army's big offensive look like? The allegations in the Ukrainian press are scaring the Russian army because the Ukrainian press always says that Kiev will use 30,000 drones for the big operation of 30,000. Drones can completely destroy all Russian targets in Crimea. After this extraordinarily large drone operation, it is planned that Leopard tanks will enter Crimea and take complete control of the city. The Russian army can do nothing against drone operations. Putin's biggest fear is to lose all his power in Ukraine as a result of a major operation. That's why the meeting in the Kremlin was quite tense. It is claimed that there was a crisis, especially between Peskov and Putin. Although Peskov claimed that all security measures were taken, the destruction of the fuel tanks angered Putin. It is claimed that Putin is very angry with Peskov because of this incident. On the other hand, the president of Ukraine is making bold statements about this operation. These statements increase Putin's anger even more because the Russian army is being disgraced all over the world. In his latest statements, the Finnish press Zelensky said the following: I believe that the major offensive will allow us to celebrate the Crimean Peninsula, which has been under Russian occupation since 2014. Our army is determined to take back Crimea in the event of full armed support of the Western allies. We plan to push back to Ukraine's borders recognized by the world in 1991. Zelensky is determined to liberate Crimea. The Ukrainian army is expected to launch a major operation against Crimea very soon after Zelensky's statements. The war is now in Russia. A massive Ukrainian raid on the main artery of ammunition in Belgorod. Russia has no strength left in Ukraine. Hundreds of tons of ammunition have been destroyed thanks to this operation. The Russian army is at a loss. Putin literally went crazy when he heard about this operation in Belgorod. His policies against the soldiers in the army have made a big echo all over the world for some time now. Ukrainian soldiers have been preparing for a very big operation in the Russian-Ukrainian war. This operation was based on putting the Russian soldiers in a difficult situation instead of engaging in a direct confrontation with them. This difficult situation would lay the foundation for the Ukrainian army to achieve success in many areas, because the Russian soldiers who had fallen on hard times had no strength left to endure on Ukrainian soil. The Russian soldiers who were still forced to attack on orders from the Kremlin, despite many troubles, were put in a defensive position with the stab of the Ukrainian army. Because the Ukrainian army made a very big operation this time, many Russian young people who were taken from Russia within the scope of mobilization continued to fight reluctantly. No one wanted to fight for Putin after this recent serious deterioration of the conditions due to the success of Ukrainian rights. Realizing this reluctance, Ukrainian soldiers began to think about what they could do to get Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. At this point, a very strong intelligence was transmitted to the Ukrainian army. According to the information conveyed to the Ukrainian army, all ammunition and supplies sent to the Ukrainian region were gathered in a place in the Belgorod region. After this meeting, Russian soldiers determined what was needed for the fronts and directed these trucks to different fronts. In other words, the most critical ammunition network of the war in Ukraine was in this region. It took Ukrainian intelligence almost 6 months to get this information. But thanks to this information, Ukrainian soldiers were now in a position to organize a very different attack. And this attack proved to be a big enough attack to be the end of the Russian troops in the Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian army found out that the gathering in Belgorod takes place approximately once every 3 weeks. Knowing that a ground attack would be quickly repulsed, the Ukrainian army decided to attack from the air or with long-range missiles. Bayraktars mobilized for the Ukrainian army. The Bayraktars, which moved from Ukraine towards Russia, first conducted a very serious reconnaissance in that region. The fact that the area was a valley enabled them to determine that a major bottleneck would be created by the detonation of the front vehicle of the Russian convoy. This information completely changed the Ukrainian operation. If it could keep the Russian army stationary, the Ukrainian army could easily use long-range Patriots and HIMARS. But there is a small problem. It was not known whether Russia had a defense system covering this area. To find out, 2 Barracudas were sent to the area as kamikazes. When the Ukrainian army realized that the area where the convoys were gathered was only a little bit outside, they had already decided what kind of operation they were going to carry out. Ukraine first sent Bayraktars towards the area once the coordinates of the area were written down by the HIMARS and the long-range Patriots. It was all up to the Bayraktars. Although the Bayraktars had accomplished great things since they entered the service of the Ukrainian army, they had never done anything as big as this operation. About 23 Barracudas were sent to this area. They flew at a very high altitude, which was invisible to the Russian army scouts, and they flew into this area realizing that a very large convoy was gathering in this area. The Barracudas started bombarding, but the start of this bombardment, Russian soldiers started to scatter towards the surrounding area. The Russian army responded with rocket launchers and managed to shoot down 2 Barracudas. But the Barracudas had bombed so critically that it was no longer possible for the Russian army to get out of this valley. The signal was given to the long-range Patriots and HIMARS. The bombardment began. With this bombardment, the Russian convoy was fired upon one after another. Especially the missiles hitting the ammunition trucks started to explode. Everything in that area, one after the other, but the real explosion happened right away after that. This convoy had a very critical importance for Russia. The Russian army was going to take a very big step against Ukraine for this. A large number of explosives were on their way to the Ukrainian territory with this ammunition convoy. The truck was cornered before the delivery and Russian soldiers tried to take it out of the area, but it was hit by a missile and caused a huge explosion. With this explosion, the Russian convoy was completely blown up. When the Ukrainian Bayraktars continued shelling after this incident, the convoy and many armored vehicles were literally destroyed. But the force of this explosion drove the surrounding units of the Russian army in that direction. Realizing this direction, the Bayraktars began to retreat towards Ukraine. The Russian army arriving in this area hesitated and informed the Kremlin. All the ammunition of all the troops in the Ukrainian sector had been destroyed. It was not yet known what the Russian troops would do because of this destruction. But for the Russian army, which was already having a hard time, this move was recognized as the beginning of a very big problem. The Russian army did not know exactly what to do against Ukraine. Russian soldiers were waiting for ammunition and supplies in their positions, and this disappointment led to a lot of trouble. It is known that the soldiers were in groups within themselves and got into huge arguments with the commanders. It has been known to the whole world for a long time that the ammunition sent was not of very high quality. At the beginning of the war, the Russian army entered Ukraine at a very high speed, and when it was seen that it left at the same speed, a large number of vehicles and ammunition were left behind. While Russia's economy suffered a huge budget deficit due to the destruction of these ammunition and supplies, it was determined that Russia, whose weapon stocks were not enough, gave weapons from the Soviet Union period to these soldiers. The statements made by one of the captured Russian soldiers were of a nature to confuse Russia. The Ukrainian army knew almost everything that Russia had in this case. Ukrainian soldiers who knew all the weaknesses of Russia continued to take steps accordingly, while the statements made by the captured Russian soldiers showed this to the whole world. The Russian soldiers said that Russia had recently sent very old weapons, stating that these old weapons are not only useless in war but also injure and maim many soldiers, even during trainings. The soldier revealed how much Russia values the soldier. This situation brought Russians whose relatives are at war to their feet. The people who thought that no one in the Russian army was worth anything started to revolt against Putin, whom they were angry with because of the economy. These uprisings were further fueled by the rhetoric of Kadyrov, put his #1 ally. When the Russian people said that a lot of soldiers were being lost and that there were not enough supplies for the soldiers at the front, Kadyrov said that if you continue to protest, I will send you to your relatives. While these statements had a huge repercussion all over the world, they showed the world once again how hard Russia was losing the war. In other words, with this statement, Putin indirectly acknowledged that the war was lost. This shows that there is a very intense acceptance of a loss in Russia. This is a multi-signals that the war will soon end in favor of Ukraine. The Russians rapidly changed their axis of advance and tried to catch the Ukrainians by surprise with a sudden attack from the west. They prepared a powerful fist consisting of several tank companies, but unfortunately for the Russians, this resulted in devastating losses and a huge scandal with demands to fire all commanders involved in planning this operation. Here, the Russians canceled their assaults in the direction of coal mines and Boulder itself and started moving around this town. The primary goal of the Russians here is to cut supplies from Bahia Blanca, and they can achieve it either by attacking it directly or by penetrating the territory in between. Their secondary goal is to lengthen the front line and force the Ukrainians to stretch their forces along the Bulge, which should also undermine the ability of the Ukrainians to reinforce Volodar. This is a very questionable decision because the Ukrainians can deliver supplies through Vodny. Nonetheless, as reported by the Ukrainian General Staff, the Russians started moving in the direction of Bahia Blanca and Pachuca. The local geography is also not on the side of the Russians, as they are once again attacking from the lowlands. It looks like the Russians took control in the area in front of Shevchenko, got across the river and launched a powerful attack in an attempt to take the local hills. Even at first glance, the prospects of assaulting Volodar from the west look even grimmer than from the east. From the east, the Russians at least managed to get on the hill by moving from McCluskey, which allowed them to assault Ukrainian positions from the same elevation as you might remember. Around a week ago, I told you that the Russians moved to Volnovka dozens of pieces of equipment and a lot of manpower in preparation for a heavy push. And as it turned out, their job would be to penetrate the front line west of Volodar. Unfortunately for the Russians, the recent drone footage showed that the Russians lost 13 battle tanks and 12 infantry fighting vehicles in a single engagement, which means that a fresh Russian tank battalion lost its combat capability in one day. A Ukrainian reserve officer also reported that right now the fights are mostly conducted by ethnic Tatar volunteer battalion instead of Russian Marines. This suggests that the Russian Marines from the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade sustained insurmountable losses and were replaced. This is not surprising considering that the Russians had already lost half of the Marines in this brigade when they stormed Pavlivka. This caused a huge scandal in which all Russian media sources shared a devastating critique of the Russian command demanding to fire the high-ranked officers. The main point of the critique was that Russian vehicles advanced in one line, which made them a perfect target for the Ukrainian artillery. However, even though there are many ways to solve this region, all of them are bad. These fields stretch for almost 10 kilometers and they have been densely mined by the Ukrainians, which means that the probability that a vehicle runs into anti-tank mine is almost 100%. In order to make sure that they make a deep penetration despite the mines, they were ordered to move in a column, betting that the Ukrainians discovered them too late. However, the Ukrainians discovered them on time and destroyed them with their artillery. The total Russian defeat in Boulder has ruined the upcoming massive offensive operation. Judging by the number of forces devoted to this region and judging by the fact that the Russians engaged a lot of tanks in each of their attacks, it is clear that they intended to take Volodya and not just conduct combat reconnaissance to fix Ukrainian troops. The Russians needed to create a sudden breakthrough here because the battle for Bakhmut has been going on for so long that the Ukrainians have adjusted. So the fall of Bakhmut is unlikely to change the global setting. On the other hand, the fall of Volodar would require rapid deployment of strategic reserves in an attempt to stop the penetration. But the breakthrough did not happen. The Russians suffered extensive losses, and when they finally launched their offensive in the Luhansk region, their mobilized soldiers will have to deal with fresh Ukrainian troops. This will lead to a much slower pace of advance than planned, which will slow down even more with the return of the rainy season.